varmt välkomna. Hello everybody, I will start speaking in English. Please have a seat, the last of you who are coming in. Hello, my name is Camilla Sedendal. I'm the CEO of Destination Sigtuna, and we are the organizers of this festival together with a lot of other organizations in this wonderful town, I must say. When we started this festival 4 years ago, we had a vision of creating a place, a meeting place, where people could sit down and talk about important questions. And what could be more important than speaking about the freedom of speech and democracy that has always been very high on our agenda. I just came, I listened to the dissident and the Lithuanian poet, Thomas Venclova, right before I came here, and it was a wonderful talk, and now we're going to hear one more. When you work with the Literature Festival like I do, we all have our dream authors, and Masha Gessen, you have been mine from the very, very start. See, I studied at the Department of the Soviet and East European Studies in the 80s. And when Putin came to power, we were all lost in a blank. And we didn't know who he was. And you gave us so many answers with your book, The Man Without a Face. So I allowed myself to dream from that very start in 2012 that you would come, and here you are. So we look very much forward to this important talk, and you will talk to Björn Wiman, who is the head of culture at Dagens, who himself has written numerous articles about the freedom of speech and is very dedicated to that. So to all of you, welcome to Sigtuna and very welcome to this important talk. Thank you.
Yes, welcome everyone, and especially welcome to you, Masha, to this our beautiful summer day here in Sweden. You might find us a bit ecstatic, the Swedes, but that as I tried to explain to you before our conversation here, that's entirely on account of the weather. If you've been here a day with rain, 14 degrees and so on, you would find us a bit more moody, I'd say. But we're very happy to have you here. There are writers who challenge systems that are bold, and then there are writers that are brilliant. Masha Gessen is a writer that is both bold and brilliant. We have seen this in your two books that are out in Swedish, the biography about Putin, The Man Without a Face, and in the brilliant reportage about the resistance group Pussy Riot, Words Will Break Cement, the passion of Pussy Riot. We can also regularly read you in international publications such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, Washington Post, and I'm happy to say sometimes also in Dagens Nyheter. Your latest work in book form is the Tsarnaev brothers, about the two brothers who executed the Boston Marathon bombing. And I know that you at present are working on a second book about Putin. So I thought we start there with Putin, because I know you actually met him once. Could you characterize who is he? How was this meeting?
Well, it was a very bizarre meeting, and it is my absolute best cocktail party story, but it's very difficult to believe. So what had happened was that I was the editor of the largest popular science magazine in Russia, and actually the largest quality magazine in Russia, and I refused to send a reporter when Putin went hang gliding with the Siberian cranes. And for this I was fired, And then after I was fired for this, I tweeted about it. And after I tweeted about it, Putin called and asked me to come in and talk to him. And it began with my thinking that it was a prank. I mean, it was obviously somebody calling me pretending to be Putin, but pretending really well. And so during this phone call, I was preoccupied with figuring out something very smart and witty to say, because this was clearly going to end up on YouTube, and I had to sound good. So he was saying, I heard you got fired, and I was unwittingly at fault. And I was thinking, okay, well, so what I'm going to say is, if you really were who you say you are, then this is what I would say. All I have to do now is come up with what to say. And then he said, you know, my nature conservation efforts should be kept separate from politics. But for a person in my position, it is very difficult to separate one from the other. And I thought, this person is brilliant, because this is so Putin. And, you know, by that time I had spent years in Putin's head, trying to be in Putin's head, watching his video recordings and audio, listening to audio, and I was thinking, this is exactly what Putin would say. That sort of denigrating the office of president, sort of saying, for the person in my position, but at the same time trying to ingratiate himself to me by eliciting my sympathy. That's exactly what he would do. So I still couldn't come up with anything smart to say, and then he said, if you don't mind, let's meet. And I said, well, how do I know you are who you say you are? And he said, well, after we hang up, you're going to get a phone call from the deputy head of my administration. He's going to schedule a meeting, and then I'll come to the meeting, and you'll know. Which is pretty much what happened. His first words to me were, now this is because I refused to write about his adventure of supposedly saving the Siberian cranes. So his first words to me were, I like kitties and puppies and little animals, which was supposed to establish his credibility as a protector of nature. And then, and this is particularly interesting now, actually, he went on to tell me just how sincere he was, and how he saw it as his mission to draw attention to important issues, including not just nature, but also history, which is why he had, at that point, dived down to the bottom of the Black Sea and come up with 2 ancient amphorae from the Hermitage. And he repeated this last week. You know, and he came up from the bottom of the Black Sea again and said, oh, it's just, you know, completely strewn with amphorae now. But I decided not to pull any of them up. So he continues to engage the Russian public in a conversation with its ancient history in Crimea at this time.
So this is, I mean, the description in your book, The Man Without a Face, creates the image of a grey bureaucrat who just happened to come to power. And is that still the right characterization on Putin?
Absolutely. I mean, he is still a grey bureaucrat who happened to come to power. He has evolved over the last, he's been in power, it's actually 16 weeks. 16 years last week. It was 2 weeks ago. He was appointed Prime Minister on August 9th, 1999. So, I mean, my adolescent children don't remember a time before Putin. It's really scary. So he's obviously changed somewhat. He has really come to think of himself as a statesman, which is something that was very difficult for him early on. Early on, he thought of himself very much as a bureaucrat, and I mean, another horrible anniversary this month is the anniversary of the Kursk Disaster, the submarine that sank in August of 2000. And at that point, I think he sincerely tried to stay out of the way, because he couldn't conceive that he was a state leader. He had to be there and sort of show that he could take charge. Part of the reason that disaster was so terribly fumbled was because he didn't interrupt his vacation to go to Murmansk. He was vacationing in Sochi. That has changed. he had become very comfortable with being the center of everything. In fact, he'd like to be at the center of the world forever. So now in that sense, he's quite different. He has not become any more intelligent or any more cultured, or he doesn't know much more than he did. In fact, I would argue he knows less. He's in this typical, and I'm not saying this to be funny. I'm actually trying to describe what's happened to him. He's in a typical dictator predicament of being surrounded by very, very few people. And getting less and less information. And he's been watching his own TV for 16 years. So the reflection that he sees has become his reality.
In the title of your book, The Man Without a Face, I mean, is in between this very grey, bureaucratic, dull person, but it also creates the image of a demon, almost. Is there a risk that we here in the West, who tend to see Putin as the incarnation of evil, that we demonize this character, that we create a kind of Satan or a kind of Sauron in the Lord of the Rings? Yeah. This man, this is just a politician, after all.
Actually, I don't think he's just a politician. I mean, I've encountered this question before, and to be perfectly honest, I don't quite understand it. I mean, I think that and perhaps it's a difference of sort of thinking about people as politicians or as dictators, and I think these are different categories. And I think that when people in the West say, let's not focus so much on Putin, let's not demonize the one person, I think that it's a deep perception speaking that of a state that functions in a much more sort of systematic, democratic manner, where we would benefit from understanding the system, we would benefit from understanding complexities. There's very little complexity to what's happening in Russia. There really is one person. And I'm not saying that if there were no Putin tomorrow, things would get magically better. I actually don't think that would happen. But I also think that it is right to focus on him, because what has happened in Russia in the last 16 years has very much been a function of this one person and his limitations, but also his talents. I mean, he does have a talent for holding on to power, and he has very, very strong instincts. He's been greatly empowered by what has happened in the country before. The people have endowed him with almost unlimited power, but he has great instincts for using it.
You wrote a very interesting article last year in the Los Angeles Times, where you describe what's special with Putin in a global perspective as a politician or as a dictator is that he doesn't even pretend to be good.
Right.
He describes the world not as rotten to the core.
Right. It's an interesting function, and that's actually not true just of Putin. It's true, I think, of the entire sort of Russian elite's mentality at this point. The idea is that the world is rotten to the core, but some people are better at pretending that they're good than others. And what Russia is basically saying to the world is, come on, stop pretending. We know everything is bought and sold. We know everyone is evil. We know how the world works. And it's actually, there's something incredibly seductive about that invitation to simplify things, to something that sort of explains away everything except the basest of motives. But I also think that it offers a kind of protection to Russians who are confronted with other realities. Earlier this year, I was in Estonia at the Leonard Meri conference, which is an annual conference, sort of the big post-Soviet conference. And the president of Estonia actually asked me a question. He said, what happens to all these people that we've been sending to the West, like all these Russians who've been going to study in the West? Why don't they come back changed? And I think, for one thing, it's an incredible conceit to think that you can send somebody away for 4 years and they'll come back changed. But for another, because there's a basic worldview that is really important to Russia right now, with which people go abroad, and everything they see through that prism, Really, it's not the way you pretend. It's not, it's not an ideology. It's not political convictions. It's not certain ideal. It's not the idea of fairness. Everything is bought and sold, and we are the only ones who have the courage to be open about it.
Is this also the case of this, as you all know, the fierce anti-gay legislation that Putin has come through and that has led to very harsh personal consequences for you? Is this the case here as well, that don't even pretend that to be good?
You can see it that way. I think that it's the anti-gay legislation, and which is, in fact, the anti-gay campaign, which is much bigger than the legislation. The legislation is just a small part of it. The anti-gay campaign, which has been a cornerstone of the new Russian ideology of traditional values, and which has been ongoing since at least 2012, it does sort of invite Russians to say, look, you have been asked over the last quarter century to pretend to be tolerant, to pretend to be European, and all of this is foreign to us. Just relax, just be yourselves. And it is seductive in that way as well. I think there's a real kernel of truth to it. And a kernel of truth to it is that yes, of all the things that Russians have sort of been asked to take on that were foreign to them, it's probably one of the most foreign. This idea of tolerance toward people with a different sexual orientation, the idea of gays and lesbians at all. I mean, it's a brilliant target. Of all the minorities to pick, he certainly picked the most profitable one.
Mm. You recently, in a recent column, you compared the situation to the gays in Moscow to the situation of the Jews in Berlin in the 30s.
And I did it quite consciously. I think that gratuitous comparisons to Nazi laws or the Holocaust are not very useful. I don't even think that the comparison of Putin to Hitler is particularly useful. This, I think, is a useful comparison because what's actually happened in Russia in the last 3 years is that a particular group of people was picked out, was pointed out, was in a way forced to identify, to self-identify, and then gradually rights have been taken away. So the first right was the right to homosexual propaganda, but what the law actually says, or the way it's been explained by the courts, is that homosexual propaganda is the distribution of information that can harm the physical or spiritual development of children, including forming in them the erroneous impression of the social equality of traditional and non-traditional marital relations, right? So it's actually a law that makes it a crime to talk about equality. It's a law that creates, in law, right, second-class citizenship. For these people, it is not only wrong to talk about themselves, it's wrong to talk about their rights, right? And then gradually other rights have been taken away. The right to adopt children was taken away. The right to get married is about to get taken away. Obviously there are no same-sex marriages in Russia, but they're about to ban transsexuals, right? Not transgender people, but transsexuals, people who have transitioned and who have documents in which their sex have been changed. They're about to ban them from entering into marriages, right? So it's you can have your surgery, you can change your documents, but you forever forfeit the right to get married. And it's a really weird law. But it very much follows that Nazi pattern of, as though randomly, taking away certain civil rights that other groups have.
And which will be the next step, you think?
Well, there are two pieces of legislation that are lying around Parliament right now, and I don't know which one they'll adopt first. So it's either the transsexuals getting married, or it's a new mechanism for taking children out of same-sex families. Now, de facto, that's been happening. Social services have been going after children who have LGBT parents, or whose parents have been accused of being LGBT, right? There's also that going on. But I think at some point they're going to enshrine it in law. That legislation has been sitting in Parliament for about a year and a half.
And that's what also forced you to leave, with your family, to leave Russia, and you currently live in New York.
Yeah, it's, you know, I have a hard time talking of ourselves as victims because we've actually landed in New York. But yeah, we had to pack up and leave pretty soon, quickly, because there was a direct threat to my family.
And this was in the process while you were researching and writing the second book in Swedish, the book on Pussy Riot. But you don't have had any trouble working with the book at this time, you yourself as a journalist in Russia?
I'm lucky that I've actually been able to go back and forth. We don't let the kids go to Russia, but because I think that's where we're most vulnerable. So they don't get to see their grandparents in Russia, but I've been going back and forth and reporting.
And you had to, I mean, your book on Pussy Riot is a very close encounter with these three women that constitute this group. And it's also a logical follow-up on your biography on Putin, I'd say, because this is about the movement and the people trying to resist this system, the Putinism system. The Pussy Riot resistance, you call it at one point important art. How much do you think that the threat that the Pussy Riot resistance poses to the system is about that it is art and not downright political protest?
Well, the options for political protest in an authoritarian country that's actually rapidly transforming itself into a totalitarian one are very limited. I mean, if you think about it, right, political protest depends on the existence of democratic mechanisms to have any impact. If people can go into the streets and protest and nothing happens except they get arrested, that's not very effective protest. They have no parties which to pressure. They have no politicians who are accountable to them. They have no media in which to be reflected, right? So it's the sound of a tree falling in a forest, political protest in Russia. Whereas what makes art particularly effective in a situation like that is that it does make a sound. And when it is effective, it makes a sound. And I think that the Pussy Riot, that particular work of art, right? I mean, I'm assuming that not everybody has read the book on Pussy Riot. Pussy Riot is not actually, as many people think, a punk band. Pussy Riot is a protest art collective, one of whose fictional characters is a punk rock band. So these characters went to the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which is the most symbolic cathedral in Russia, and staged a protest called the Punk Prayer, which targeted the symbiosis of church and state in the lead up to Putin's re-election campaign. This was 2 weeks before he was elected to his third illegal term as president. And they were arrested on the day that Putin was re-elected, and they got 2 years in prison. Now, this is just 2.5 years ago, and they were the first people in Russia to go to jail for peaceful protest. And to think about that now, that I mean, it's become so commonplace. Or not 3.5 years ago, right? So it's become normal that people go to jail in Russia for peaceful protest, and they were the first. So that was one of the reasons that I thought it was really important to write about them. But also, I think their work of art began when they entered the cathedral, and it ended 6 months later with their trial, and the reaction of the public, and their trial, which was completely Kafkaesque. All of that is part of what they were able to elicit and to show to the world through their art. It's incredibly effective art.
And they were also part of a movement, I mean, with Russian artists who worked in this tradition before them. How much do you think that the aggression that they let loose in Russian society had to do with the fact that them being women and not men?
Right, so everything about them really grated on the Russian power elite. the fact that they went into the cathedral, the fact that they were women, they were young women. So a lot of what we heard in court was their skirts were too short and their shoulders were exposed. There's nothing, actually, there's no rule that women, and in fact their shoulders weren't exposed, but there's no rule that women have to wear skirts of a certain length in a cathedral when there are no services, right? But something about, and they went, this was very important, that they went into the cathedral to stage their punk prayer when there was no religious service ongoing. So they could not be accused of disturbing a religious service. And yet, everything about their appearance was disruptive. That's what they meant to do, and that's what they did.
Some of you who haven't read the book might think that, as you said yourself, Masha, that Pussy Riot is a kind of punk band, that they are just provocateurs. If you read Masha's book, you'll see very clearly that they are written into a very strong tradition of conscious Russian dissidents, of intellectuals. And these three women are very highly educated and very heavy theoretical basis for everything they do. The concept of dissident is very special in Russia. Could you tell us a little more about this?
Well, it's really a double-edged sword. I mean, part of the reason the concept of dissident is so special is that free thought and critical thinking is so rare. And when you have somebody who is actually capable of thinking on their own and who's capable of expressing that thought, that really stands out. It was an odd relationship between the state and the intelligentsia, especially in the 70s and 80s, sort of where the state's repressive function amplified the importance of the word. And when finally censorship mechanisms were lifted in the late 80s, the floodgates just opened, and big literary journals had press runs of 3 million. And then very quickly it turned out that actually the number of people who were interested in reading what these literary journals had to say wasn't that much bigger than their original audience. So there was that sort of short moment of access to the forbidden fruit, and then the forbidden fruit didn't turn out to be all that interesting. I think we may be in another period of sort of word inflation, because word is becoming so precious again. It's a much less, it's a horrible thing to say, but it's an even less idealistic period than the 70s and 80s. Because I think if people really felt that words will break cement in the 70s, when Solzhenitsyn originally wrote that, it's much more difficult to believe in that now.
Because you write at some point in the book that someday they will be placed in the Russian history of dissidents at the same place as Solzhenitsyn, as Brodsky, and so on.
I actually think, I compare them quite consciously to Solzhenitsyn, and that was one of the reasons that I chose those words for the title of the book. Nadia, the mastermind behind Pussy Riot, used that quote in her final statement in court, which is included in the book in its entirety. It's an absolutely brilliant piece of rhetoric. And I thought it was a really, in a way, it was very smart and hopeful of her to say it. I also thought it was really sad, because here she was expressing this thought half a century after it was originally expressed, and was it was no closer to being true. But at the same time, I think the comparison between them and Solzhenitsyn is important, because I think that Solzhenitsyn accomplished something that no amount of information, no newspaper reporter, no politician had accomplished before him, which was really change the perception of the Soviet Union in the West. When the Gulag Archipelago was published in the West, that's when sort of, I think, people began to understand the nature of that country. I think when the Pussy Riot trial was ongoing in Moscow, that's when people who were perhaps not that engaged with the news most of the time, really something shifted in the way they perceive Russia. And they've gone back, unfortunately, to perceiving Russia as, in Ronald Reagan's words, the evil empire. which makes us cringe because it sounds so simplistic. I also happen to think that's correct.
That's also a kind of we have returned to the situation during the Cold War when, I mean, with Sting could write lyrics like, I hope the Russians love their children too.
Right.
Are we in that situation today again, you think, in the West?
Didn't he sing the Russians love their children too?
Oh,
I hope
perhaps.
the Russians... I think that's important.
I think he said, I hope the Russians love their children too.
Really?
I don't know.
Because I think the idea of that song was that we can understand the Russians and we shouldn't be afraid of them because the Russians love their children too. And I think that's actually a really good example of something that's very well intentioned and horribly misguided. Because the difference between living in a state with a functioning democracy and living in an authoritarian/totalitarian state is that it doesn't matter if the Russians love their children. Because when Putin makes a decision about whether or not to use a nuclear weapon, he's not going to think about what's going to happen to all those Russian children.
You also used the term now, the evil empire, although within quote. We here in Sweden, as you all know, we have this underlying fear, you could say, perhaps, of the Russians, and you can see now in the public opinions about the Swedish defense and so on that this question has risen very dramatically in the Swedish public sphere in the last 2 years since the invasion of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine. Are we right to fear Putin and Russia here in Sweden today?
Yes, in a word. Just a couple of facts about what's happened in Russia in the last, say, dozen years. One is that Russian defense spending, both in absolute terms and as part of the federal budget, has increased by more than tenfold. When Putin came to power, the percentage of the federal budget that was being spent on defense in Russia was roughly the same as in the rest of Europe. It is now far, far greater, comparable only to the United States. Now, a lot of that money is being spent on drawing up plans. And one observation that some smart people have made about the operation in Crimea was that it was clearly planned a long time ago, because it was carried out so quickly, so efficiently, and really seamlessly. It was one of the few true successes of Russian operations, comparable only to the Sochi Olympics, perhaps, in the last decade. And so the conclusion, I think that conclusion is correct. I think the conclusion that's erroneous, that some people have drawn is, so they wanted Crimea all along. That's a strategic objective. Unfortunately, I think things are a lot worse than that. There are many, many different plans, because a lot of that money is being spent on drawing up plans for annexing Crimea, annexing parts of Ukraine, annexing Moldova, annexing the Baltic states again, grabbing a piece of Finland, showing Sweden who is boss. All of that is available. All of that is in the repertoire. And what happened in Crimea was that the opportunity presented itself. When the opportunity presented itself, that plan was taken off the wall like Chekhov's gun. Except imagine, the first act in which there are 100 guns on the wall. And you get to choose in the last act which one to take. And I think, when military exercises violate Swedish airspace over and over and over again, that is a direct message. It's not a mistake.
You make a distinction when you write about Putin between a mission and a plan.
Mm-hmm. Right. So he doesn't have a plan. I'm still maintaining that. He has many plans available to him. And he has a mission. The mission it's a civilizational mission, right? So Russia has, in the last 3 years, gone from thinking itself or trying to think of itself as a nation state. It never really happened, right? It never sort of entered a post-imperial state of consciousness, but it now thinks of itself as a civilization state. The idea is that there are two kinds of civilizations in the world. There's the Western civilization, with its silly ideas, that is trying to force down our throats, and there's the traditional values civilization, also known as the Russian world. And it's not a geographically specific concept, it's very expansive, right? It can include Ukraine, and it can include the post-Soviet countries, but it can also include Finland. It can also include Greece, because they have traditional values, political parties, and they share the idea that perhaps that traditional, or some of the political parties there share the idea that traditional values are much more important than the values forced upon these countries by the European Union. For example, the True Finns party, which says, look, when we were part of the Russian Empire, we had our own currency, we had our own parliament, we made our own laws. Now we don't have our own currency, our parliament can't make a step without the European Union, and we don't make our own laws. And Russia sees that as an opportunity to expand the Russian world. And so the traditional values civilization can even include China when that alliance is important.
So it's all connected with the rise of the extreme right in Western Europe and the Putin strengthening his grip.
It's connected sort of spiritually and mentally with the rise of the extreme right. It's also connected financial. I mean, these financial relationships are extremely hard to trace, but the relationship between Marine Le Pen's party and the Kremlin has in fact been traced. There has been a lot of funding going in that direction.
Okay, Masha, we were very happy to have you here, and we don't want to let you go quite yet without giving you in the audience one or two opportunities to pose very brief questions to Masha if you want. Is there someone who wants to?
Okay, let's see, I have a microphone here. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question?
Here's one gentleman who will.
That's okay.
Very shy.
Sir?
Swedes are very shy.
Yes, picking up on this business of the evil empire, or the idea of empire in general in Russia, would you say that this is so important that it overrides everything, all other considerations? I mean, Putin would never dream of doing a Lenin, for instance, giving up part of the territory like he did in Brest-Litovsk in order to consolidate his power. I'm thinking, for instance, why continue to have Chechnya as part of...
I'm sorry, could you speak into the microphone?
Sorry. As far as the empire is concerned, do you think that it is such an important consideration that Putin would never consider doing a Lenin, for instance, like in Brest-Litovsk, giving up part of the territory in order to consolidate his position? I mean, for instance, why does he hold on to Chechnya, where the situation, I mean, it's not, is it part of Russia ethnically? It isn't, I suppose, but, or could one, is empire really the sort of his overriding idea now?
I wouldn't say that empire is his overriding idea. He has, and the country that he has built has a really strong identification with being a great power. So it's very difficult to see a great power giving something up, especially giving up land. Right? Also, Russia has a history of thinking of itself as a country under siege. Although it's very difficult to imagine how it can perceive itself as a country under siege when it's basically been expanding most of the last 1,000 years. But that's the mentality. It's not completely impossible that he could give up some territory in exchange for something else, but I can't see that opportunity arising. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to imagine.
One last question. Here.
Oh, oops.
My question is, first of all, I want to thank you for your book, which is wonderful, on Putin, and very frightening reading. And I think one thing that struck me when I read it was how I thought if this were not real, I would find it comical, because it's so surreal. And I was thinking, is this not a very big danger that we don't take Putin seriously because he's so, in a sense, he's so ridiculous, the way he manifests himself, like you said, with the cranes, this kind of story, and going undersea and so on. And my second question is, how can you, as a journalist, risk your own life going back and forth to Russia? You must be putting yourself at stake. It must be quite dangerous.
I think that the idea of somebody ridiculous at the head of the largest landmass in the world with a large number of nuclear warheads is really scary. So I don't think there's a contradiction between ridiculous and scary. He doesn't have to be great to be absolutely terrifying. In fact, I think his smallness is absolutely terrifying. As for risking, as a journalist, I don't feel right talking about it because there are journalists who are living in Russia who don't publish in the West, whose lives are not, watched by audiences and publishers all over the world, who are on the ground every day getting beaten up, getting threatened, and getting killed. Part of what has protected me is, even before I emigrated to the West, is just being known in the West and being published in the West. And at this point, my risks are negligible compared to the people who are there every day. And there are people who've been getting beaten up and killed this year for exposing the Russian involvement in Ukraine, the fact that there are troops on the ground, Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine, that cost a couple of people their physical health. Just documenting that fact that is absolutely obvious to everybody in the West, and yet documenting it in Russia meant that they were beaten within an inch of their lives.
We're very happy to have had you here to remind us about this very important fact as well. Thank you, Masha Gessen, for having you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely.
Vi kan säga om boken sen.
We have a gift for you. It's a notebook with unwritten pages so that you can continue your great work, the two of you. Masha Gessen will sign her books downstairs. And when we imagined this talk, we didn't think about the heat, so we put some water down there for you so you get something to drink. After this, you can meet Fiona Sampson, who's a poet, and who is not in your program, so go down, drink some water, get your book signed, and then you're welcome back up here again. Thank you.